welcome to the Goldmoney Roundtable of 2022, coming to you from the beautiful and historic Royal Society in London. I'm Nancy Hungerford, and I'm delighted to host the panel this year, where we're going to be discussing the very important issues of inflation and the cost of living crisis. To do so, it is my pleasure to bring in our esteemed panelists. Joining me here, we have Alasdair Macleod, who is head of research at Goldmoney. We also have Josh Crumb, a founder and special guest panelist with us. Stefan Wieler, who is, of course, an energy specialist and director at Goldmoney. James Turk, founder at Goldmoney and director. And Roy Sebag, founder and CEO of Goldmoney. Well, it has been a remarkable turn of events, if you will, since the last time we held this roundtable 2 years ago, if you can believe it. Nothing to report back, right? But let's begin and just get your assessment from each of the panelists on perhaps what the most important events have been and how this brings us to where we're going today. Alasdair, why don't we begin with you?
Yes, I think, Nancy, the most important thing is what has turned out to be an enormous surprise to the establishment, and that is the resurgence of price inflation. And this is very, very serious because it's not generally known, but something like 70% of the working population live from paycheck to paycheck. So when you get things like housing costs rising, when you get energy costs rising, when you get food costs rising, this has a very serious impact on them. And it's not just a question of eating into their standard of living, but we're talking about the basics of life, which have been shooting up in price. But if you look at energy, electricity prices have been, they've just skyrocketed. And not only that, but they've been incredibly volatile. And families, they look at their electricity meter in absolute horror. They don't want to look at it. It is really very, very, very bad. Other energy prices like petrol and diesel, they've also shot up. Huge, huge moves. And then when you look at the cost of housing, which is probably, until this happened, the largest element of anyone's budget if they were renting,
True.
That has also shot up. We're looking in London at something like 13, 14%.
Wow.
We're not talking about, the CPI going up, say, 8 or 10%. We're talking about these very basics, which are so much more important to families. So when we talk about families, look at what's happened to the price of bread. That has shot up as well. Look at what's happened to dairy products. Butter over the last 2 years, from my own experience, has doubled in price. Cheddar cheese, another staple. Cream, all these things have just shot up. And then if you look at meat as well, meat prices have just gone through the roof.
Right.
They really have. So the impact on families must not be underestimated. This is very, very serious, and we're coming into the Northern Hemisphere winter as well, which basically is going to heighten these problems dramatically. Energy consumption is going to shoot up.
Yep. And
when you look at the cost of production of things, energy is such an important component of it. And it's not just energy, it's all the other raw materials, and the food stocks that go into the production of processed foods and so on, they're all going up. I'm afraid to say that this is a process which has just started, and we are relatively early in what is going to be an enormous squeeze on families.
Well, Alasdair, some of what you said is quite worrying, I must admit, and we'll get into the details of what that inflationary picture looks like in just a few minutes. But Josh, I want to get to you first here.
Yeah, so picking up on some of Alasdair's points and thinking, I think to the problems that are under-recognized when we're talking about particularly energy-driven inflation. One is that it's actually not price so much that rations demand as volatility. And this is something I believe so many people get wrong. Because so many times, like that basic energy or that basic raw material, as it's passed all the way through the supply chain, sometimes by the end, there's a lot of things you can do on price controls and everything else. But we actually ration our demand by breaking parts of the supply chain. And I think that's something that when we're looking at the cost of living for the public, a lot of that can be sheltered in the early days. But it's the infrastructure of economies that start breaking down if they're not set up to handle the volatility of commodity prices and inflation. And so, And when we look at something like gold, like why is it that gold becomes so important to the individual saver? So forget about the banking system and and national economies, planning. We get into this very macro central planning view of the world. But at the individual saving level, why is it that gold works? Gold works because it has those same energy cost inputs. It's naturally correlated to those same things. So holding gold is almost like an economic battery for those basic goods, and it actually works. Its correlation and its ability to save in energy and food is what's most important for the saver. And I'm sure we'll get into the banking system and talking about much bigger macro issues, but I think it's important to bring it down to the individual saver as well.
Okay, yeah, looking forward to that further discussion, especially as we look to gold's role in all of this. Stefan, why don't you come in here with your expertise on energy?
Yeah, we talked about energy already as part of the reason why inflation is up so much, and I think that's a really important component, but I think I would go beyond the just price. What we saw for the past, since the beginning of the year, basically, was a real supply shortage. So it's not just the price that is hurting people, but it's literally the availability of energy. And it's particularly, at the moment, this is very heavily concentrated in Europe. And I think we have a chart we can show to the viewers where you can see that it is mostly on the electricity and gas side in Europe, where you can really see what a shortage means. We talk about a global energy crisis, and prices of some other energy sources have gone up as well, particularly refined petroleum products. So we look at oil prices, and a lot of people think, we are at $100 or we're below $100. The all-time high was 148 in 2008. If you look at this inflation adjusted, we're actually quite far away from that. But some of the refined products, we are already there, and we exceeded actually these all-time highs. So jet fuel, we are there in diesel. So we have a massive global diesel shortage at the moment. And so people are feeling that. At the moment, they're feeling it through the price. And as devastating that is, the real pain comes when you actually run out of the thing. So far, we haven't had any blackouts in Europe. The price has moved up to prevent this, right? So we are seeing unprecedented demand destruction in both gas and electricity right now in Europe on all levels. We see it obviously in power. The power sector tries to get away from gas as much as possible. But we see it on an industrial level, and this is devastating then for the economy to come down. So this will, even if this goes away right now overnight, there has been a lot of damage been done to the industry in Europe. And we see it on a individual level. So residential demand actually for gas is extremely low because people simply do not turn the heating on, and they have no other choice. So far it has been very warm in Europe, and actually that brought these prices down. But going forward, the real problem will be the availability of energy, and not just, or I would say rather than the price. So that actually can have an even more devastating impact than the price. And we're going to talk about this later in the outlook, but I think this is not something that is just now acute, but this is something for many years.
Yes, yeah, no, and we'll revisit that certainly as we get deeper into winter, what that looks like. James, over to you now. What would you say are the most important issues we're facing right now?
Well, I'm the oldest person here in the panel, so I've lived and worked through the 1970s. I began my business career at the late 1960s. So it's inevitable that I compare this current situation to what I lived through back in the 1970s, and it's very worrying because we have many more problems to deal with today than we did back then. The debt is much bigger. We have this huge mountain of derivatives that really didn't exist in the 1970s. There are more geopolitical conflicts, I think, today than there were in the 1970s. It was easier to live within a bipolar world where you're protected by nuclear umbrellas. Nobody was going to create issues. But the problem that we have today is that interest rates are rising. In the 1970s, rising interest rates were a solution And over 7 years, Paul Volcker, when he became chairman of the Federal Reserve, brought inflation under control. Today, rising interest rates are a problem because of the level of debt we have. So for me, it's very, very worrying, given the amount of dollars that have been created over the past few years, or not just dollars, but actually all currencies around the world, because all central banks have been rapidly expanding the money supply. And if we follow Milton Friedman's advice that inflation is always a monetary event, we have a lot to worry about. And I'm looking forward to this panel discussion and some of the solutions we're going to be discussing.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. And Roy, what do you see?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's really nice to be back with all of you, my dear colleagues, here at the Royal Society again, and especially grateful to have Josh here. Yeah, I think that we're at the most important period since the Second World War. And what I am particularly focused on are three issues. The first issue is the level of destruction that has been caused to the ability for the farmer to overproduce food. And I don't think this is being appreciated or discussed. And so what's happened is that the farmers are resorting to a kind of subsistence or organic farming process to try to capture the inflation on the one hand, but reduce their inputs on the other because their costs have risen so much. And what this means is ultimately less weight of food produced. And if you think about that just a little bit, it puts a kind of lower limit to what inflation could decline to, and it also places a lot of pressure on the policymakers because if they try and pivot prematurely, I think that we end up having hyperinflation. And it's kind of rhymes with what Stefan was saying, you know, a market assumes you have supply and demand. If you have no supply, then you have no market. And the second issue that I'm focused on is geopolitical. Now, it's obviously top of mind that we have a kind of proxy war in Ukraine that could, at any moment, escalate to a kind of armed conflict, you know, more overt armed conflict between the East and the West, let's say. But what I'm more focused on is, and what I think is more plausible, is that you're going to see some kind of peace negotiated where certain members of the Western Alliance in Europe begin to reorient their own allegiances towards China and the East. And I think that that will have wide-ranging repercussions on how we think about the global order. And the third issue, you know, is more technical and perhaps more relevant right now, especially for market participants, and one I haven't seen discussed enough, and that is the potential risk that very large companies like Google or Apple or Microsoft either diminish the rate of their stock repurchases or suspend them entirely. And I don't think that anyone's prepared for what kind of effect that would have on the liquidity of equity markets. So those are the three issues that I'm most focused on.
Very interesting. And that last one is not something we hear about that often. So thank you for bringing that into the mix. And I think really the reoccurring theme we're talking about, not just here, but everywhere in the city and around the world, whether you're on the London Tube or in the boardroom or trading floors, is about inflation. And Alasdair, you gave us a really nice scene setter to set up some of the big issues that are also hitting households and just the real human story behind it. So why don't we delve deeper there?
Yeah, why do we have inflation? I think the easiest way to describe this is to imagine a world where money is sound, and that means that we can't buy everything. We have to choose. We buy this as opposed to that. But when you start expanding the quantity of money, people can then buy this and that. And this is what drives up the general level of prices. As to James's point about Milton Friedman saying inflation is everywhere and whatever, a monetary phenomenon, that is why. And just bear in mind that we have come out of a period when the Fed reduced interest rates to zero, the Bank of Japan introduced negative interest rates, the ECB and the Euro system introduced negative interest rates, Switzerland introduced negative interest rates. We went down pretty much to zero, along with America. But when America went down to zero, at the same time, it started doing quantitative easing, which is pure monetary adrenaline, if I can say the word properly, into the economy of 120 billion a month. I mean, we're looking at an injection of over $2 trillion in that process. So you can see how the combination of making money ultra cheap and just hosing money at the economy has led to the situation we have today, where prices are beginning to rise. I mean, this has happened time and time again in history, and unfortunately, as a race, we humans don't learn much from the past. I mean, one of the interesting times when this happened a long time ago was in the 12th century in this country. I think Henry II was on the throne, and in those days, we had people called moneyers, and moneyers basically were licensed to produce coins of the realm in their localities. But what they were doing was they were debasing the coinage. And the effect of the extra coinage that came into circulation as a result of this, unfortunately, coincided with a harvest failure. And so people started starving. And I was sort of reflecting on this and thinking, you know, this is actually pretty much what we have today. And, you know, about 7, 8 centuries ago, I mean, surely we should have learned from that, but we haven't at all. And so, the other point about it is that when you reduce interest rates down to zero, that was the end of a trend of interest rates which was started by Paul Volcker, ramping them up to something like 20%. We went down to zero. We are now moving in the opposite direction. And this is a major, major shift. And the effect on financial markets, I think, is going to be considerably greater than anyone thinks. Because we have financial markets which really, they've become increasingly financialized because that's where the money is when you get falling interest rates. You know, you make profits on your bonds, on your equities, and so on and so forth. Banks from Big Bang in London, which was 1985, have increasingly moved away from financing genuine production in the real economy. Apart from anything else, all the economies disappeared over to Southeast Asia anyway. So, you know, in a sense, you can see why they did it, but that was the direction in which it's gone. And so you had all this money which has got bottled up into the financial sector. Now that interest rates are rising, that money is now escaping, or what might be left of it, because there are going to be huge losses. And as far as the banks are concerned, they have loans which are secured by collateral. And this collateral is going down in value, and it's very worrying to bankers. So what you're seeing is the banks, having expanded their balance sheets to historically record levels, are now in the business of trying to reduce that exposure because they suddenly see the risk of rising interest rates, how it's going to undermine the loans. They're going to have bad debts and all this. You know, we've got to get out of this, lads, is really what they're saying. And the effect of this is very, very far-reaching.
And we're going to delve a bit deeper into the banking system and the role central banks are playing here a little bit later on. I'm fascinated by this point you're making, though, on the households and what they're facing, which is potentially a food crisis, if you will. And I know you have some charts that really illustrate this, if we can just go into that a bit further.
Yes, I mean, I mentioned them earlier. I mean, if you look at energy prices, electricity, that has shot up. Yeah. We have an electricity crisis in Europe because in this country, we haven't actually had a coordinated policy towards electricity production. Nuclear electricity has been shut down because it was unviable, because all the subsidies that had been pushed into green energy basically meant that Hitachi had to pull out of Anglesey, and so that was the end of that. We're really left without a coordinated policy. And so now we're trying to import electricity from France when we have shortages here. But guess what? almost half French electricity production or nuclear production is shut down for maintenance or cracks in the concrete or whatever it may be. They've got a problem. So electricity prices have not only risen, but I think they're going to rise again further. And as to Stefan's point about fuel, I mean, the shortage of diesel is extremely important because well over 90% of logistics in Europe, someone quoted to me a figure, 98%, is driven by diesel. So what happens when we get a diesel shortage? You know, not a question of the price, but it just isn't there. Yeah. That is very, very serious.
Very serious.
And so we've seen the you know, sort of petrol and diesel prices increase substantially. I think we're probably in the beginning of that rather than towards the end of it. You know, again, you know, I mentioned housing costs. What's happened to mortgages? Yeah. Mortgages have shot up in cost. I mean, we've got a little bit of a pause, but I think that's a pause in an ongoing trend, I'm very sorry to say, because interest rates have not risen enough to discount the loss of purchasing power of the currency. You know, we're hardly there, and we'll probably get into that a little bit later. But it also, if you look at, you know, the sort of food staples, you know, these things like bread, dairy products, yeah, I mean, they have continued to rise and rise. And again, I don't see any end of this. And it's interesting, I live in the West Country where I'm insulated to a degree from this because country prices are a lot less than they are in London. I come up to London, I look at the prices, my jaw drops. Yes. How people in London can afford to live here is incredible. It must be the same in New York and Washington, I would guess.
Yes, it's
similar.
Getting to be pretty surprising, let's say, when you go into your typical drugstore or grocery store.
Yes.
And I think you mentioned something interesting too, not just the mortgage situation, but rents, as you point out, are just going higher and higher.
Yes, I mean, that's been a function mainly of property prices. I mean, I produced a graph some time ago of London property prices measured in sterling and also in gold. And the thing that's fascinating is that all that's happened with these property prices is that you know, they've just discounted the debasement of the currency. That's all that's happened. Yep. But you know, you talk to anyone about property prices in London, they say, my goodness, they've shot up. I mean, it's just multiples, like 30, 40 times over the last 50 years. I mean, these are huge, huge rises. And it is continuing. I mean, you know, the mortgage problem is going to put a cap on it, but if you're trying to rent in this market, you're looking at the return on the capital values. Right. And, you know, rent is a proportion of capital values. And the other thing is that, you know, government policy is to restrict the rental market. Why? Because they offer, understandably, protection to the renters, you know, the people who've got nowhere else to live. That makes it, as far as the landlords are concerned, an interference, if you like, in their property rights. And they are less keen to invest in providing rental properties. So you've got a supply situation, which is very, very serious.
Okay, at some point, we're going to have to figure out how to fix these problems. But I think James, referred earlier to the situation in the 70s. And I just want to finish here with you first, Alasdair. I mean, you talk about history repeating itself, but what we're living through right now, would you say it's an aberration?
No, it's the consequence, really, of losing all control over the expansion of money and credit. I mean, we had this back in the 70s. And when I look at the 70s, we are not there yet. Okay. The prices, I mean, we peaked, we had sort of peaks of inflation, you know, CPI inflation running at close to 20%. In this country, it actually hit 24% at one stage. I think that was about 1975. But, you know, when you look at the rate of inflation today, it is actually higher because what they have done is they've changed the method of calculation in 2 or 3 steps, which has had the effect of suppressing the apparent rate of price inflation. So we have actually, I think, a more serious inflation problem than the statistics would actually tell us. But the other point about it is that if you try and use interest rates to deflate demand, and that's something which actually doesn't work, but we'll probably talk about that later, then looking at the relationship between where interest rates are and where the rate of inflation is, interest rates have got a lot further to go up. And that means, coming back to the housing costs, that is going to impact very negatively on housing. It's just going to break the system if it is allowed to run.
Interesting. Just how far do they have to go is the next question. James, I do want to get back to you, though, since you gave away your secret that you were the oldest panelist here. What do you think, you gave us a little bit of a teaser here, as it, relative to the 70s, what we're facing, but would you agree mostly with what Alasdair says?
I agree completely. We don't learn from history. We have to re-experience these things again and again. We try, I think it's human nature, to explore. We've explored the world, we're exploring space. And we explore financially as well until we eventually go too far and we have to then retreat. Seeing things through the eyes of a banker, because I was trained as a banker, it all comes back to interest rates. And I think, to Alasdair's point, they haven't really risen to the extent that they need to risen to solve the inflationary problem. But I don't think they can rise because we just can't service that debt. When you have interest rates, you have to generate the cash flow. You have to generate the wealth in order to service that debt. And what happens during periods when you're expanding the quantity of money, which Alasdair explained so clearly, what do you do with that money? A lot of bad investments get made. And when you start doing, again, what Alasdair calls the great rewind, which is what we're going, or unwind, what you're going through right now, that a lot of those bad investments, they're going to be defaults. You can't pay the interest on it. And as a consequence, that creates economic problems from all of that bad investment. So it's sort of sad that we have to relive history, but there was an American philosopher, George Santayana, who said that if you ignore history, you're going to relive it.
Right, and I think the other question is, how long does this unwind last? Hard to
That's
tell.
impossible to predict, but we can look at the 1970s. It took Paul Volcker 7 years to bring inflation under control. I think it's going to be at least that long if we take a sound approach to it, but you just can't predict the future. But we're not really bringing inflation under control yet. That huge amount of money has been put into the system, and it's got to be resolved one way or the other. We used to say in banking that loans are always repaid. They're either repaid by the lender or they're paid by the banker. A bad loan is an event, and you can relate that to the entire economy in terms of all of the bad investments that have been made and what the implications are for the overall global economy.
Yes, it does seem a global problem. I'm not sure if it makes anyone feel better that we're all in it together.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Yeah, that's certainly the state of it. Roy, I see you nodding your head. Do you agree with what's been said here?
I agree mostly, but I have, I think, some points of objection, if I understood Alasdair correctly. So from my perspective, I know that the inflation we're living through is the worst that it's ever been in my lifetime. But I also think that this inflation is an aberration, and I don't think it can be compared to the 1970s. I'm not sure if that's what you said, because later you said that it was different statistically in the way we calculate it. But to my mind, again, if I just return to the issue with farmers, so I'm a third generation farmer, and over the last 3 years, I've actually returned to my roots and have been farming again, and livestock and crops. And what we're doing and what the farmers I know are doing, again, to try and capture this inflation, is we're basically eliminating any input, because higher rates have affected the cost structure of producing this food. And these decisions are, I'm not going to say they're permanent, but once you enact them, it's very difficult to undo them. You're dealing with nature, you're dealing with harvest cycles, and the net result is you produce less weight of food, but because the commodity price has risen, you're basically making the same amount of fiat money, let's say. Now, when I look at that, I cannot see any scenario where food production by volume doesn't consistently decline, at least for the next decade, and globally. And if these policymakers pivot too early, as I said earlier, then that could continue for multiple decades. And I think that in the 70s, there was definitely broad inflation, but it was very much concentrated in a few commodities and in energy. And the other issue I see with trying to compare it to the 70s is the base of where interest rates were before they started raising rates to where they peaked in terms of mathematical percentage is incomparable. I mean, they've already raised interest rates by 500-600% from where they were 6 months ago. And you won't find that the rates are anywhere similar in the 70s. So rates are being raised faster, at much greater tenor, and inflation, I think, is more broad-based and more fundamentally undermining the whole notion of prosperity. There's this unspoken truism in modernity, which is we're always given these lofty ideals of prosperity and promised a technological utopia and how ethical we are and morally righteous. But all of that is predicated on the tangible prosperity: food on the table, a place to live that's warm, clothes. That's where you get hope about the future. And what we're dealing with is something that's fundamentally undermining that real prosperity. And people are expressing this. And so I think that's also fundamentally different because it's taking place globally. So our leaders, they really need to prepare us for this, because what I find particularly striking is that the explanations for the causes of inflation are unsatisfactory. Now, you can expect from politicians and economists to never accept blame for something. That's in their ego. But I've spoken to several central bankers over the last 6 months, and I'm not entirely sure that they understand what the true cause of inflation is. I'm not sure that they're capable of it because of their economic models and ultimately their economic philosophy. And so what I see is this constant denial and gaslighting. It's COVID-19, it's supply chain issues, it's Russia, or in Christine Lagarde's own words, it came from nowhere. Right. Now, what I need to see from the politicians and the economists right now is to prepare us for a very difficult time where we need to reorient society to the real economy. And that is more important than what they do with rates. That is more important with where inflation ultimately peaks. So long as we are not being prepared and not being given the truth about the causes of inflation, which are always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, then my concern grows. Now, the only thing that brings me some sense of hope is that it's only going to take one country or one leader in a world of 190 countries to fix this.
Right.
And I think that's what's going to happen.
Okay, that's a good cliffhanger to find out who that is, where that is. But Josh, just quickly to you, I know you may have some thoughts on what's been said already.
Yeah, again, I wasn't there in the 70s, so I get to play, desktop analyst on all of this. But I think another thing that's very important that's different in what happened before, so the energy shocks and the geopolitics, there are some similarities to the 70s. However, the global economy and the structure of the global economy was radically different before the what we came in. So it's, that's one difference. And it really comes back to the monetary structure of what happened before, right? So what have we done the last 10 years, with zero interest rate policies and negative real interest rate policies? We've bid up the value of existing assets, particularly real estate, and existing cash flow streams, right? So we took existing wealth and we bid it up significantly by lowering interest rates and through stock buybacks and everything else, right? So we have this structure that's going to be very hard to unwind. And so the question is, how does that change when we need to go back to a physical economy? Because this is where this is the only way to get inflation back in the bottle. It's actually not through rates and that. It's actually getting actual upstream production. And how do we actually get that upstream production? Particularly since the interest rate, the theory, of course, of raising interest rates is the Phillips curve, right? So the effect on labor is what's happening. But the problem is, because, and this is the second difference from the 70s, we were in a gold standard sort of coming into that period in the old Bretton Woods standard, right? Or quasi-gold standard, right? A Bretton Woods standard. But what we've had since then is this hybrid structure where you have essentially one sort of dollar economy, which is essentially China, with a semi-peg, the Middle East and the energy producers with a semi-peg, and the US. And then you have all these floating currencies. So what's happening right now with raising interest rates and tightening up the credit in the banking system is we're not actually rationing the Phillips curve in the US or in any sort of pegged economies. It's coming into emerging markets. We are literally starving places like Bangladesh and India. And so our effect is actually hitting the floating currencies in the economies that can no longer afford importing energy, right? So that's the other thing that's very different than the 70s is where our monetary policy is actually making the effect. It's not in the lower labor classes of the US. In fact, no one wants to hire people that actually work hard, in the real economy. The jobs are getting lost at Twitter and in the service economy. But the actual hard workers, it's not getting hit in the US, it's getting hit in emerging markets, particularly ones with floating currencies.
Well, that's a great way to transition into our topic of energy, because really, this is the crux of the issue when we talk about inflation, isn't it, Stefan? I know this is your area of expertise, so weigh in.
Yeah, no, I think this is an excellent point. And we have actually argued this a lot in the past, and we wrote a report about it. You can read it actually on our website. There's a very strong link between energy prices and the price of everything, because energy is simply an input good any production needs. It's in the industrial process, it's in farming, you need fertilizers, you need transportation, etc. So when prices of energy prices rise, this has an inflationary effect, not just from the energy price itself, but on the rest of the goods produced in an economy as well. And so it's actually very easy right now to point at the war in Ukraine and say we have this energy crisis and this is driving the price of everything. That's what inflation is coming from. And to some extent, this is not entirely false, because the epicenter of the energy crisis is in Europe. And we have a chart we can show the viewers that shows the Germany baseload power prices for next year, and that has completely exploded. It looks like a penny stock. And that is driven entirely by the rise in price of gas, which looks like a twin of that chart as well. And the reason behind it is that Europe imported more than a third of its gas from from Russia in the past, and that has been down to about 10 or 5%, depending how you look at it. So in Europe, the system is completely stretched. In order to get or to actually balance that market, Europe has started to import more LNG, but that has been completely maxed out. And Josh can talk about this later. And then there is really nothing you can do on the supply side anymore to fill that gap. So then you have to go through demand destruction to get there, and that's what we currently are doing. However, there has been energy price inflation in other commodities as well. And it's really important that we distinguish there, because even though there's a link between different energy commodities, one drives the other to some extent, and there's some switching. That switching is not, there's a limit to the switching. So you cannot fill your Tesla with diesel when you run out of electricity in a country. And the same is like even on the power production side, there's a constant switching between the fuels, but there's just, at some point, you have to run that gas plant and you cannot replace it with anything else. And so that sets the price. What we have seen is that the prices of things like oil and particularly refined petroleum products have also gone up.
Right.
And they don't look as extreme as the electricity and gas prices in Europe, and that's why we kind of tend to ignore and we just talk about, oh, there's a general energy crisis and it's driven by the events in Ukraine. But the reasons behind why oil prices are up are very different. We talk about something that is in the making for many, many years, and that is actually a supply crunch. It's years and years of underinvestment in the sector, and it's an increase in cost of production.
Right.
And I mentioned this before in the first section we had. Oil prices compared to the refined products haven't even gone up that much. It's really that diesel prices and jet fuel prices have gone up that much because there we had chronic underinvestment in the refinery sector. And you can argue, yes, high gas prices also add to that because it's very gas intensive in Europe. But this is something, and then we go back to, in the end, it's a monetary phenomenon. So I would argue that the low interest rate environment we had probably also aided with the outlook that we don't want to have fossil fuels anymore in the medium-term future. Makes it very difficult for producers actually to invest in new assets.
Interesting.
And we are now at the point where there's really only very few regions in the world where oil production can grow. So we have a chart here as well. You can see over the past 15 years or so, there's actually only has been one region, and it's the United States.
Yeah.
And there has been some smaller, Russia, Canada, but they really haven't added much compared to the United States. So it was really that there was this shale oil boom we had over many, many years, and that basically helped to meet the growing demand we had in the world. And the problem we're having right now is that, first of all, this production growth in the US has slowed down tremendously. So we're now seeing extremely high oil prices, but we do not see a reaction from the oil producers. In fact, 12 months ago when oil prices, or even 18 months ago, the production forecast for this year and for next year were much higher than what they actually turned out to be. Even though now oil prices are a lot higher than, let's say, in the beginning of 2021. So the oil producers finally turn a profit, but they also fight with really high interest rates right now.
Got it. Okay.
And so they can't expand their production. And the chronic underinvestment anywhere else in the world, and I think this also I have to mention this quickly, US shale oil is probably the most instantaneous kind of production we have. You can put money to it, and a few months later, oil comes out. Anything else has a lead time of 5, 10, sometimes even longer, 5, 10 years or longer. So in order for oil to come out next year, that investment had to be made in 2013, and that hasn't been made. So we're now in a situation where production in the rest of the world is declining, and is declining for the foreseeable future. There's no projects in the pipeline that would bring non-OPEC production even to flat. So this declines. The US is no longer growing. And OPEC has been told as well that we don't need their oil anymore in a few years. And they have the same investment cycles right now. So their easy, low-hanging fruits have been harvested. And they also have to invest in these extremely expensive projects that have 5 or 10-year lead times. And they don't want to do that either.
Right.
So this is something that is, I mean, that's my view. Everybody sees it in the industry that this is an issue. My personal view is that this actually has its foundation in low interest rates and all the financialization of that industry. Yeah. And that is something that is yet to come. So we don't really feel that yet. That's something we're going to feel over the next few years, and that can't be solved overnight. So it's really, there's only really a little bit inflation coming from that side. The Ukraine event is really, it's creating a lot of trouble in Europe, but the rest of the world, we're not having high prices and diesel shortages because of that.
Yep.
We're having high prices and diesel shortages because of chronic underinvestment in that sector.
It's such an important point because the headline we read, are so focused on the Ukraine-Russia crisis, and I think you're drawing on really good lessons globally in what's happening in investment. And Josh, I know this is something you know a lot about. I mean, you're building out a natural gas exchange. So what can you tell us?
Yeah, so I mean, this will be a recurring theme probably through this whole conversation, the connections between energy, inflation, money, gold, geopolitics. These things are all very, very intertwined. So, picking up on some of Stefan's points, you talk a little bit about, well, there's two pieces to look at, what this means for the banking system and what this means for financial systems, but also just at the very, in the very near term, what this means for inflation. And I'll actually disagree with you on one thing. Europe is not the center of the energy crisis. I mean, it is in our Western minds and in media. The real center of the energy crisis are places like Pakistan and Bangladesh, right? So they, when we set out to build ABEX, the company I've been building a new natural gas exchange, we're focused on two things. One is 10 years ago, I had a view that all roads lead to natural gas, no matter what sort of path the world took, unless we had some total revolution in energy. From the supply side, big oil was becoming big natural gas, right? That already started a decade ago. But on the supply side, it's really about emerging markets and electrification, right? So beyond just the energy transition, the electrification of places, particularly after the wave of China, like moving from the urbanization of China to the urbanization and sort of the rest of the developing market, this was all very, very electricity based. And they really had two options, a lot more coal and the pollution we have, or natural gas. Like those are really the only two options that we could go. Now, of course, there's been a great investment in renewables, and I actually do believe that was something that was probably underappreciated, was the technology and the cycle and bringing costs down in renewables. That has been I think an amazing thing to displace a lot of coal. But the problem is it's lowered the resiliency of many systems, right? And of course, again, tying into geopolitics, you get to the point of less resiliency in a place like Germany, combined with natural gas, coming from Russia. Like they just basically lost all resiliency in their energy system.
Maybe if I can add on this quickly. So it's very interesting to see what the build out in renewables did in Europe. And from the point of how much electricity production comes from renewable, it has been actually a huge success story. So Germany produces over 40% of its electricity every year from renewable sources. We got there, like the European Union, like a long time ago, set out this goal to decarbonize its economy, and it started with the power sector, and it did this with several pillars, I would say. So first of all, it outright subsidized solar and wind. That's clear. It set the carbon price, so it created this carbon market that when the price goes up over time, it incentivized power producers to switch to less carbon-intensive power production. And then it also, on top of that, it outright closed coal and nuclear power plants. So what that meant for natural gas consumption in the beginning, because natural gas was very cheap back in the days in Europe. And so there was a lot of baseload production coming from gas, which wasn't necessary in the sense. And when the renewables came in, they actually pushed that out first. So natural gas consumption for quite some time declined in Europe. But then we hit the point where there was not really a lot of baseload natural gas production, electricity production in Europe. And the renewables that have been added since then, they had to replace something else. And they replaced coal and they replaced nuclear. And so what that meant is now you have more and more renewable energy production, which is quite unreliable. So you actually need more gas now because you have to fill the gaps when the wind doesn't blow and when the sun doesn't shine. That's the only thing you can use that quickly because there's no storage solution for that commodity. We don't have big batteries yet. So in a weird way, Europe consumes less gas now than it did 15 years ago. And it's definitely going to consume a lot less this year, just it's forced to. But even before, it consumed a lot less than 15 years ago. But it's way more dependent that gas flows. If you interrupt that flow, like everything breaks down immediately. And I think that's part of what we're seeing right now.
Would you agree, Josh?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think getting back to the point about planning, right? These are very long cycles. There's a lot of sort of hope that somehow this is a 1 to 2 year event in Europe, and then everything will get back to normal. But that's just not how commodity infrastructure works. Typically this is something like a 7 to 9 year cycle. The first couple of years, it actually takes a couple of years for people to even realize we have a problem, and we haven't trained enough, engineers. Wall Street hasn't trained enough energy analysts. So you have this human capital and physical capital deficit that takes almost a couple of years to even know we have a problem. And then you kind of get in the planning phase and the McKinsey phase and everything. Like everyone starts thinking about it. It's actually I was joking with these guys last night. I was listening to a podcast of some policy energy analyst in Washington or whatever. And again, they've been so wrong from 5 years ago. They didn't predict any of this. But now it's like watching a chart, and it's just like you're forecasting. Your conversation is always, of course it's about energy. Yeah. So it's amazing because no one's thinking that these cycles are a minimum 7 to 9 years. Yeah. And I think so we're going to have a couple of years of just figuring out that this is going to take a long time to solve, and that's when the capex infrastructure will then have to start coming.
But to the point about lawmakers, if you were sitting down with them, what would you advise? Because what I hear from Stefan is saying, in a lot of ways, there just aren't alternatives to fix what is essentially a supply problem.
Yeah, well, I think this. So I'm actually headed to Brussels, just after this meeting. So
timely,
very timely. I'd say the problem is again, it's a very short term. They're looking at very short term solutions, right? Yeah. You could even go back a few months when Germany was talking to Qatar, where a lot of the LNG growth is largest player in LNG, but also a lot of the growth. And they're like, we want your gas this year and next year, but we don't want it 10 years from now. So Qatar's like, okay, well, we're only going to make this investment if it's a 10-year cycle.
Got it.
So that's the problem. And so you've got these short-term political realities of elections and populism and all sorts of things that are happening. But to actually build this infrastructure, you need much longer cycles.
How long? I get that the Qatar would want the long-term commitment, but how long would it actually take if both sides agreed? They said, we're going to take your gas to get the gas flowing, so to speak, into the country.
Again, it's a multi-year process, okay. and there's just no shortcut to this. Okay. And that's just the physical infrastructure side, the building of regas, floating regas, building the new liquefaction trains in Qatar. So there's the physical capex side, and again, you can't shortcut this stuff, not only because of environmental issues, but also just safety. These things blow up. Like you can't shortcut an engineering cycle for something that has zero margin of error to go wrong, right? So these just take time, and so again, when we built ABEX, looking at So there's the physical infrastructure, but the other part is the market infrastructure. Yeah. The market infrastructure is also incredibly important and something that we tend to do wrong, in many ways. And so what's been missing is more and more commodities has just been hyper financialized, like everything else, right? To the point where our two big, basically there's a duopoly in global energy markets, and that's the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, which bought the NYMEX of the New York Mercantile Exchange, and NYMEX is where you have WTI oil and Henry Hub and so forth, and then you have ICE, and ICE bought. Blanking on the name, but the UK energy markets, which is the Brent crude oil contract, and then a lot of the power and gas contracts in Europe are part of ICE. And look, there's others, but these are the two dominant players. But I would even argue just this oligopolistic structure. In many ways, they've forgotten how to build energy markets from the ground up. So what they do now is you'll just take a survey index, right? So you'll, Platts or one of these assessments will say, oh, there was 7 cargoes traded last week, and the average price of these cargoes, like nothing's reported, but let's just say it was $12, right? So they get these survey indexes, and that becomes the price. So in true markets, in true physical markets, the way we used to always do commodity exchanges is you actually have to take delivery. They're based on warehouses. They're based on pipe interchanges and oil tanker storage. So you actually, you took a future and you took it into delivery. So there was a connection between the futures market and the physical market. But we've increasingly gone to a purely financial market that's almost abstracted from the economy. And more and more, we're able to create commodities on paper because we have good, collateral in our financial system. So, whoever has the most sovereign bonds can create the most commodities because collateral is what's creating these futures contracts. But what I believe there's going to be a transition that's needed where we go back to physical markets. We need what's known as buyer and seller of last resort. When you buy a future and you take it into, the price converges, and we need to be able to have that price signal so that we know, who can pay most for this gas. Is it Northeast Asia or is it Europe? Europe was always a sink for natural gas and LNG. Like if you had excess gas, you just dumped it into Europe, and the bidding was happening in Asia. What's happening now is there's going to be a bidding war between Asia and Europe. And then the people that can't even compete, again, are, India and Bangladesh and Pakistan and places that were about to go through this big boom. So for us, it's very important to get that price signal right and get that market infrastructure right so that companies can plan and can make these investments. Like, companies don't want to make beyond the energy transition and some of the policy that's anti-hydrocarbon, just from a pure price perspective, a company doesn't want to plan a 10-year investment against a survey price of what traded last week between 5 traders, right? They want to be able to know that if I sell my oil forward, someone's going to take it because I can deliver it into the exchange, worst case, right? So we're missing this. We're missing this connection to markets that allows people to hedge. The U.S. natural gas and energy markets, they became the most dominant in the world because we had very clean price signals. You didn't have to run around and ask every politician, what the price was going to be to invest. You just, you started drilling and then you did the hedging, and Goldman Sachs would sell it forward on the NYMEX, and your capital was secure. But we don't have that right now in Europe, and we don't have that in Asia. People can't see a forward price that they believe, so it's very hard to do the hedging. So there's the physical infrastructure that takes time, and there's the financial infrastructure that takes time, and we're in an early stage of building both.
Well, I'm glad you're going to Brussels. You'll have to report back on how those conversations go. But listening both to you, Josh, and Stefan, it's clear that what is happening in the energy markets and the so-called crisis is much deeper than simply what's happening geopolitically. But Alasdair, I look to you and I say, it's still an enormous factor. I mean, if we were to get some news on a ceasefire, some sort of resolution, and just the terrible war that's taking place between Russia and Ukraine, don't you think markets would breathe a sigh of relief?
Well, it could be a little premature. I mean, the thing that's interesting is, let's go back to why it was that President Putin decided to invade Ukraine. He'd seen the Americans get a bloody nose, or rather NATO get a bloody nose in Syria. He saw the abandonment of Afghanistan. He saw a new president who, compared with President Trump, was at least a lot more predictable. So there were a number of factors which came together, which suggested, firstly, that the Americans were on the run in the Eurasian continent, and secondly, with a new president, this was probably the time to try and push the Americans out of Western Europe. And that, I believe, was basically what he wanted to do, because it's the Americans with the Brits at the same time, sort of trying to maintain this world policeman's influence over Europe, as it were. So, I mean, it's in a sense, we're sort of still continuing from the Second World War, when we created NATO. Yep. So when he invaded the Ukraine, I feel fairly sure that President Putin had sort of thought out 3 or 4 chess moves ahead. And he could see, I think, that the sanctions would be brought into play.
Yeah.
So what has happened there, I think, is no surprise to him at all. And he followed that up, and I was discussing this with Josh off camera. His response to say, well, if the unfriendlies, as he calls us, want to have our oil and gas, then they can pay in rubles.
Yeah.
I mean, what a smart move. The ruble moved from about 150 to the dollar, and it's currently sitting at about 60.
Yeah.
The strongest currency in the world. I mean, that's what he's
Played
achieved.
right into his hands. Yeah.
But there is the broader issue, and that is, in the West, we're turning our backs on fossil fuels. So look at the situation for, say, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia sees their future markets, not in Europe, not in America, not in the European countries, but in Asia. And this really, I first noticed a long time ago because I was interviewing a director of a Swiss refiner, gold refiner, and he was telling me that the Middle East was sending in 400-ounce LBMA bars to get reprocessed into the new Chinese standard. This interview took place in 2014.
Wow.
So, apropos of us with energy planning, not even needing 2 years to think about it before we do anything, I can tell you that in the Middle East, they were already thinking in terms of geopolitics that long ago. So this is not new. We've now found that Saudi Arabia and the UAE are looking to join BRICS, which is, if you like, effectively a joint operation run between China and Russia. You have got the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which binds up virtually the whole of Asia. And on top of that, you've got another organization called the Eurasian Economic Union, which is planning to set up its own trade settlement currency to completely replace the dollar. So we can see which way this is going. The problem we have is that we unfriendlies in NATO and our supporters, like Japan and South Korea, are roughly, I suppose, 1.5 billion people, if that. Whereas if you're looking at the membership of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Economic Union, BRICS, including Brazil, which is quite populous as well, you're looking at around about 3 times, 4 times a rapidly industrializing population compared with us. So what is the real world? That is the new real world, which Putin and Xi are building between them.
So do you think the U.S. influence on OPEC has changed forever?
Well, this is the interesting thing, because literally in the last 2 days, we have heard that the Americans are now telling the Ukrainians, look, don't rule out peace talks with Putin. Now, this to me is a chink of light in the situation, insofar, from Putin's point of view, the pressure that he's put on the Americans and the British is beginning to pay off. And interestingly, they are now backing off from Kherson and some of the surrounding region. Now, the way this is being put in the British press, anyway, I can't talk about the American press, is that this is Putin retreating.
Yes, similar.
But I just wonder what back-channel discussions there have been going on between the Americans and the Russians. And I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect that this retreatment from Kherson is to create the environment whereby negotiations can take place.
That's interesting.
So this is important. Now, so where is the conversation? Where are these negotiations going to go? I think the first thing is that the Ukraine needs to back out of any idea of becoming part of NATO. They will have to recast themselves as being entirely neutral. And that would be the price that Russia will demand for leaving Ukraine alone. We now have the problem of what happens to the sanctions that we unfriendlies have imposed on Russia. Is that enough for us to back off? Probably not. And as far as Putin is concerned, I think he's going to want a greater degree of withdrawal from his Western borders of nuclear weapons, NATO armaments, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think the story ends with a ceasefire in the Ukraine.
I would add one more point that ties some of this together, both on the financial system and the energy markets and the realpolitik, is that I would argue that one of Vladimir Putin's goals is actually a financial war.
I agree,
And so I think that's been so under discounted. In fact, he tried this even going back to 2007, 2008. That's sort of a forgotten part of the financial crisis, is that Russia was very much meddling in Freddie and Fannie and actually trying to financially attack the system. And so a lot of the, again, there's a whole path you could go down into the politics, but I would say that this was a rearmament back in 2014, 2015. So we had gas prices, we had this bottom cycle that hit in 2014, 2015, and we didn't move up quickly, but it's been waiting. And as soon as we saw, the energy crisis in Europe didn't start this year with the war, it started last year. And it was very much Putin's view to use his leverage both in energy markets and in financial markets to attack the West, right? And that ties into China and Saudi Arabia.
Absolutely.
So I'm sure we'll have this conversation later. But it's a very important point that it's not just a physical war; it's also a financial war.
Absolutely. I mean, what I'd like to add to that I've been writing about this for some time, and I've always taken the view that this is fundamentally a financial war. And the nuclear option, the financial nuclear option, as far as China and Russia are concerned, was to use their accumulation of gold. What's now happened is that, we know what the Central Bank of Russia has. It's something like 2,000 something tons of gold. But it's now also been declared further reserves, which are held in various government accounts. And as I understand it, legislation has now been passed in the Russian parliament to free those reserves so that they can become available to the central bank. Now, we're now talking about a total of approximately 12,000 tons of gold. How much has the Fed got? 8,133 tons. So you can see, and that is being questioned by loads of people. So you can see that gold actually is becoming quite central to this. A long time ago, I analyzed the Chinese situation, and I came to the conclusion that before they allowed their own citizens to start accumulating gold, because it was banned until 2001, 2002, they were in the market accumulating gold in that huge bear market that followed the fall from in the 1980s all the way down to what we call the brown bottom in 2002. So they accumulated a lot of gold. Now, I estimated that they had accumulated in the region of 20,000 tons, undeclared, because the central bank at that stage only declared that they had about 600 tons. That was it. So there's a lot of this going on in the background. Now, I'm sure that the intelligence services and that sort of level of analysis knows pretty well what has happened there. And since then, of course, they allowed their own citizens to accumulate gold, and they actually advertised on television, go out and buy gold. It's good for you.
Isn't it, how it's changed?
And they have now accumulated in the region of 20,000 tons. Additionally.
Wow.
So this is why we saw enormous quantities of gold effectively moving from the West, because we didn't want it, into the East, as both China and Russia, well, particularly China at this stage, were building strategic gold reserves. Now, why do you do this? Well, the answer basically is that when you have a crisis of credit, then there is a flood into gold.
Yeah.
So they are already anticipating, and anyone who's learned Marxist economics knows that the first lesson of capitalism is that it destroys itself and its currencies. This is what all the Marxist colleges will teach you.
Hold that thought, because do you have more? Because we want to dig deeper into gold and currencies.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So you can see this is, the point I want to make, Nancy, is that this is such an important part of the geopolitical situation.
Absolutely.
And there's a lot more behind it, as you say. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think it's a really important point, and I've wondered this as well, whether Putin's real prize was the financial war. But I want to give James and Roy both a chance to comment on that, because it is a very important topic right now. James, to you.
Yeah, rather than looking at geopolitics, I'd like to look at just politics. And what my takeaway from Josh and Stefan's point of view was that the brew for this credit for the energy crisis that we're going through now actually was put together maybe 5-10 years ago. And there seems to be an incompatibility between two very important interests. You have the business cycle, which is a 10-year plan to create the infrastructure, and then maybe another 10 or 20 years for the market to adjust. And then you have the political interest, which is, can this be done before the next election? That's an incompatibility that just does not work.
Right.
And I think governments around the world have to realize that, leave it to the market to come up with the solutions for, how we're going to continue to advance our standards of living.
Yeah.
Interesting point. Roy?
Yeah, I mean, just fascinating listening to all of you about this, and I'm just kind of thinking, what do I infer from it all? And I think there are two things kind of occupying my thoughts. So the first would be that China is still a rising power, and the East is still a rising region, and this momentum is historic. And this is important because we're constantly being told that somehow this isn't real, in the West, from our political leaders. We're constantly being told that, somehow it isn't comparable for all these other, non-economic reasons. And I think that that's the other part of observing reality that we need to come to terms with. We need to accept that the next century might be a Chinese century. And what's that going to look like? And, I live in Oxford, and I meet a lot of academics, and when I talk about China, that they're all, it doesn't matter if they're on the left or if they're on the right. They both hate China, but they both use the same kind of catchphrases about why China's bad. And one of the things that struck me was, if you were at a salon in London, in 1776, and you heard about what was happening in America, you would have said, "Oh, these Americans, they're barbarians."
Yeah.
Has that changed?
And then,
Hey!
well, actually, it does change, because a century later, in the same salon, you're preparing your daughter to marry one of those guys,
Yeah.
because they're the new barons. And so people have to recognize that China is still in that initial phase. But in the next century, if this continues, you will see more of a movement in the West to culturally accept China, or to perhaps embrace the Chinese culture more and more. So that was one thing. The second thing that I think is actually more important for what I'm interested in is the way I understood all these amazing technical points, and I'd be interested to hear if you agree, is basically that because we've lost our relationship to the natural order and to scarcity, we've been using monetary alchemy to fake abundance. And so fracking is the perfect exemplification of that. And I think it's the stupidest way to produce energy. And because, as you say, it's this kind of energy manufacturing, and it hasn't done anything to secure our long-term needs. And so I think it's very dangerous when we don't think about conserving our energy resources as a society. And so when we allowed energy exports as something that's good, it may not necessarily be good to export our energy over the short run. And yeah, it all seems to me to come back to once you create that fake price, that fake capital, and manipulate the cost of money, what you're really doing is you're waging a war against nature, against the natural laws of scarcity.
Roy, I want to stick with this concept of monetary alchemy, because as we look past in history, we've talked about episodes of inflation we've seen, various energy crises, but monetary alchemy, you could argue, is the issue of our time.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I think, we've talked about inflation, we've talked about energy, we've even touched on geopolitics. But I think at this point in the conversation, we need to zero in on interest rates, on the banking system, but really on the role of the central bank in modern society. And if you look at something like debt to GDP in the Western world and the current rate of interests, we all know, we've all seen that somehow the math doesn't work. How can it be that the United States now has an interest servicing cost which is greater than the national defense budget. And I was reading the Communist Manifesto over the last year, which was published in 1848 by Marx and Engels, and it's a very short treatise, and they have 10 foundational prescriptions which they propose would help governments and societies move towards socialism. And one of the most important bullet points they have is a centralized and powerful central bank that controls the money supply. And I would actually argue that if you read through the 10, we've adopted at least 5 of those today, which makes you kind of wonder what exactly do we have? Is it a free market capitalist society, or is it something else? But the question for me is what exactly are central banks? Where do they derive this power? And when did we reach the point where, like we saw in the UK recently, where the central bank now has more power than politically elected officials, to the point where a central banker can get rid of someone that was politically elected? Now, I want to be clear that I actually don't think that Liz Truss or Kwarteng were solid leaders in any way, and I think their economic policies were ridiculous. But I still don't like the precedent that someone who hasn't been politically appointed by the people, who not only controls the money supply, is now also making decisions about who leads fiscal policy. Now, when I first got into precious metals and gold, one of my mentors who was already a well-known gold investor, I asked him a question. I said, when did you first recognize the importance of gold? And he said that he started investing actively in trading in the 1960s and the 1970s. And to him, the clearest sign which made him appreciate what gold is as money was in the mid to late 90s, when he noticed that central bankers the world over stopped reacting to the economy by trying to fix, as you might say, the weight and measure of money, the interest rate, and started to become kind of these caricatures who go on television and talk up the economy. And it really kind of begins when people started analyzing the thickness of Alan Greenspan's briefcase. What's he going to do? And this speaks to a kind of mastery over the economy, which, by osmosis means mastery over nature. And so we have been living through a period where central banks fully control economic outcomes. And they are not accountable to the people in any way, but also the politicians themselves are sort of blackmailed by the central banks, because the politicians can't affect any kind of fiscal policy without the central banks. And so in the Goldmoney annual shareholder letter of 2022, in June, I wrote that at this stage in history, when it's very, very clear that central banks are responsible, at the least, for the asset bubbles that are now rapidly appreciating, for the cost of living crisis, the thing that you should see in public square is a discussion about the abolition of central banking. And this should be an issue that transcends the left or the right. But instead, we've all been indoctrinated to look at what the central bank's going to do next. And not just that, but to speak colloquially about the central bank's philosophical ideas, like, oh, we're just going to raise interest rates so that we can lower the CPI, and then we're going to pivot. I mean, it's literally what everyone is now saying. And so I think that this is an acute issue, and one that's going to unravel. It always does. And we're sitting here at the Royal Society, where 300 years ago, Isaac Newton, who was the president of the Royal Society, fixed the weight of the pound to 7.3 grams of gold. Now, 7.3 grams of gold this morning is 350 pounds. But a pound this morning only buys me a pound. So something's happened to the pound.
Yeah.
And I think that if someone like Isaac Newton, who not only understood the laws of nature, but advanced humanity's knowledge of those laws, saw his role as the master of the mint as merely fixing the weight and measures of money. And today we have people that don't even accept that as a foundational principle of what they do, then we don't really know what's true. We can't even discern between right and wrong. If we don't have an objective standard that we can appeal to, it affects everything.
I can give you an example. I'd like to separate the Bundesbank from central banking, because we talk about the Bundesbank being independent and can do whatever it wants. And think about how the Bundesbank was created after the Second World War. Having fought 2 world wars with Germany, where the central bank just printed currency left and right in order to fund the war effort. The last thing that the Allies wanted was to have another war against Germany. So they made it an independent central bank, completely separate and distinct from the political process. So there was no political control over the creation of the currency that was being used in the country. And we've moved away from that. I remember the guys who ran the Bundesbank back in the 1960s and the 1970s. They had the memory of all of the previous chaos that was created from the currency problems. And they had learned from their grandparents or parents what had happened in the 1920s with the hyperinflation. So they saw it as their duty to maintain a sound currency, and they did. The Deutschmark was considered the hard currency, and everything was being compared to how well the Deutschmark was doing versus the dollar and all of the other currencies, which were tremendously inflating. What happened now is, with the European Central Bank, political control has now gone back to the politicians. The Bundesbank is no longer independent and separate. So the issue that Roy's addressing is that as long as you have a central bank that is under the influence of politicians who can create whatever kind of purchasing power conjured out of thin air in order to meet their spending aspirations, you're going to have inflation, you're going to have currency destruction, you're going to have economic and social problems. And that's the environment in which we're operating today.
To what extent, though, do you think, this is not something that central bankers want as their responsibility, and that they see it as a way to make up for the failures of fiscal policy, right? I mean, are we collectively
They're trying to
responsible
keep
'cause
the
we're
system
expecting-
going, but the system is unsustainable.
Right.
They don't want the ship to go down on their watch.
Yes. Yeah.
They're not thinking of the big picture and this road that we're on. And what we need is political will to go back to what worked for 5,000 years. And that's, of course, gold, and that's what Newton did. When Newton created the gold standard and the Bank of England followed it, up until the late 19th century when things started evolving, and then thereafter with the First World War, gold's role changed substantially, and it finally changed completely in 1971. They took the gold out of the hands of the people. And when you take gold out of the hands of the people, the central banks and governments are in control, and that's where we are today.
But I would also object to the idea that they don't want to do what they're doing. I mean, these people have free will, and they choose to take these roles in society, which means that they do fundamentally believe it. If they're being dualistic about it, if in private they're saying, oh, this is all nonsense, but we're just doing it because we're tasked with this responsibility, then they're actually being disingenuous.
They're kicking the can down the road.
Yeah, I think that they're not only do they want the job, it's very difficult.
They're power seeking.
Yeah, but it's very difficult for the common person to see something like what's been taking place at the Federal Reserve, the scandal, where for decades Federal Reserve officials were running personal hedge funds and outperforming the market and being exempt from any kind of regulation. And then, after this scandal is exposed, and it turns out that Federal Reserve officials were trading ahead of important decisions, and finally, a very simple and obvious requirement is passed, which is that Federal Reserve officials should no longer trade in stocks, that literally becomes the highest price that the stock indices have ever traded in, that all of a sudden, they start to engineer a great collapse. Now, causation, correlation, conspiracy, whatever you might call it, this doesn't pass well with the common person. that the moment that the Federal Reserve officials no longer own stocks, all of a sudden, for the first time, they talk down stocks, in decades. And so I think that this speaks of just a greater issue that power has to be taken away from the central banks. And I'm not sure that it's the politicians that are in power over the central banks. I might agree that the power that the politicians ultimately report to is also the same power in the central banks. But what it comes down to is just a concentration of capital, concentration of power, and increasingly decisions that are made that punish the real economy, punish the wage earner. And that is, again, like just the worst issue of our time socially. And we're seeing it bubble up, in the social cultural sphere.
So I'd push back a little bit on the sort of absolute power in some ways. And let me explain, why. So again, coming off of that Bretton Woods system, it's very, very important to what replaced it, right? And it was basically the U.S. sovereign bond more or less replaced it. But again, the core of your global energy corridor, U.S., Middle East, China, and China is a huge energy corridor because of coal and labor, right? So people keep forgetting about the role of Chinese manufacturing. It's not just the labor; it's also the coal. So you've got this energy corridor that's still basically all on a similar currency. And what I've seen, just my view, is because debt keeps building up in the system, they're not allowed to have a business cycle anymore. I think they realize that you have a business cycle, you have a downturn, you face financial crisis. We've been seeing this since the early 2000s, right? Every business cycle essentially ends in a financial crisis. So what they're always doing is sort of betting, like when they pull back, is that hopefully we can get enough energy production next time to keep the system solvent. So like even right now, again, we're trying to fight inflation by ramping up extremely hard as fast as we can to try to control some of this energy inflation. And it's a big bet. And they actually won that bet in 2008, right? They got the shale revolution, and they actually won that bet where we no longer had the inflationary pressures and the food shortages in emerging markets.
But that's Roy's point. That was very short-term oriented. That wasn't long-term. It didn't solve any long-term
Totally
problems.
agree. And so things keep getting worse. But to make the point on the inflation part, the part where it starts getting out of control, they also can't control politically, right? Because then you get the populist movements, and you don't know what's going to happen in the chaos of inflation. So they got deflation to protect from on one side, and they've got inflation on. So they've always been trying to play this boundary and just hoping again that food and energy can keep getting supplied.
But deflation's not a problem. It just lowers prices for consumers.
But it's a problem in the debt.
It's a problem for central banks and the creditors.
No, the issue I would speak to is that in both those scenarios that you mentioned, there is a group and segment of society that's benefiting in both situations. So why is it that on this issue I agree more with someone like Thomas Piketty? Because I know for a fact that wealth inequality is real, that the rich have never been as rich as they have been. Who does a 5% interest rate benefit? It doesn't benefit the wage earner that's paying more for their cost of living. It benefits the person that's a creditor, the person with liquidity. And in all of these cycles, the reason that I've become cynical about their role is that we have seen really like a modern serfdom develop between those that have money and those that do not. And I think that the central banks have been
access to credit, not just money.
Or access to credit, exactly. And so I think that the central banks are responsible for this more so than the politicians. The politicians lost control over the central banks, I believe, when my mentor said in the 90s that they started taking control over the economy by talking up the economy.
But something did change, very specifically to actually hit the inflation here beyond the energy story, and that's, in the COVID policies, it truly became helicopter money, right? They weren't just creating bank reserves that actually weren't leaving the system. They actually handed out checks that left the banking system, right? And the second thing they did is they basically told the commercial sector, go spend money and we'll backstop your loans, right? So those are the two things that actually got money velocity out of the system for the first time. But as I think you and I were talking before, that was the time that they started seeing all this insane wealth equality, and that we got to put this back in the bag. We can't have these people like Elon Musk disrupting the system, and that's actually one of the reasons they wanted to raise interest rates as well, is to try to stop that. But they think it's temporary. They think they can do this for 6 months, and then it's all back in the bag, and we go back to normal. This is, I think, the part that's far more dangerous.
I think what they did with the helicopter money, it was much faster, right? It translates into instantaneous inflation. I don't think just because it stays in the banking system, it's not going to create inflation. You just have to wait longer. But in the end, when you bid up assets, you bid up real estate prices. When you bid up real estate prices, then the rents will go up. Farming becomes more. It just takes a lot longer, right? So we can go back to energy. You do this, and then basically you're bidding up the assets for the energy. I mean, you said this before, kind of like what this created with the shale revolution. I think we have to make a distinction there. I think it actually works for gas, but for oil, I'm completely, I'm agreeing with you, is that it's completely inefficient way actually to get oil out of the ground and get energy out of the ground, because you stick so much in. It's so intensive actually to do this. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It's just, it basically, the financial environment rewarded this. It's rewarded of this, okay, I can stick money in and then a yield kind of comes out. And besides the monetary condition we had, it actually never worked. It's the first time these guys ever make money. But it is absolutely not sustainable. This thing is like, there is no, this is, as you said, is manufacturing, but you're not in, like the money that's being spent is not invested in the factory that is there for 30 years. The money that is being spent is basically just in the energy to manufacture. So you spend energy to get energy, and you get these tiny little yields, maybe, if interest rates on your side.
It's kind of like a Ponzi scheme for energy production.
In a way, it is.
Because you're taking energy away when you spend energy from something else.
But when you talk about helicopter money, it brings to my mind one of the worst things that's happened in the 20th century is we've lost sight of the difference between money on the one hand and currency on the other. What you're talking about is helicopter currency.
Sure.
Money is something that, just like oil, you have to put time and effort and capital in order to produce. You cannot create purchasing power out of thin air, call it currency, and think that it's not going to have consequences on the economy. So when we talk about helicopter currency, we have to remember that we're talking about something that's conjured up, paper purchasing power. And that purchasing power is competing with the purchasing power that you as a laborer are going out and trying to feed your family.
Well, and this is my problem though, because that purchasing power that's created, the tokens at the arcade, they're created through the wealthy. And so they swiftly concretize that fake purchasing power into real assets, right? And that's why you see this concentration of wealth, real tangible capital wealth. I used to do this thing when I'd look at the Forbes 400 and I'd look over the years at the different years. And one of the clearest trends you see is that if you stretch time and look for someone that's been on the list for a long time, you will see how they transition from some kind of paper wealth to tangible wealth. They start out owning shares in Microsoft or Oracle. They end by having most of their wealth in real estate, in art, and farmland and things like that. And that's because, at the end of the day, real assets are scarce. And if you have that unique benefit where your losses are socialized, but also where you're closest to the spigot, it's like for rich people in the last 20 years, whenever there was inflation, whenever there was monetary debasement, it's like they're drinking out of a fire hydrant. And for everyone else, it's like they're looking for drops of dew, like literally like grazing. But for the wealthy person, the moment, just think about what happened during COVID. Think about the depths of that crisis when we filmed the last Roundtable. And what did I say in that Roundtable? At the risk of sounding them out, I said, stocks are just going to go crazy here, because, and that's exactly what happened. They would not allow the system to fail to the point where it undermined the power structure.
But just, not to be at the defense of the central bankers, but let's just discuss what would the alternative have been, right? I mean, if you're saying they have too much power, it's out of control. I mean, especially if you look at the financial crisis. I mean, don't we agree that a lot of those measures were necessary then? So is the problem that it went on too long? Because you have to ask yourself, what is the alternative, essentially?
It's a great question.
To be faced is the alternative, sooner or later.
Yeah.
Well, no, it's a great question. Look, my position on this, which I've articulated over the years, and I don't know if you're aware, but I'm publishing a book about this on December 12th. And I don't go into this level of detail, but my position is that you have to do two things. The first is you have to reconnect money to nature somehow. Okay, so money has to reflect food and energy. But the second thing you have to do, and this is something, again, that the left is primarily making good arguments for, not the right, is you have to tear up the old debts. So what you have to do is you have to fix that problem that Thomas Piketty has identified. You have to get the wealth rebalanced between capital and labor. And so you have to tear up the old debts, you have to re-implement a sound money, and then you have to recapitalize the banks because the banks will be destroyed. Now, what ends up happening the next morning is everyone's wages is paid in real money, and their debts are priced in a debt that's inflated away. It's basically the inverse of how it works right now with wealthy people, right? But people that are wealthy today will see a sharp decline in their purchasing power.
Absolutely, I totally agree. But I just want to come back to James' point because it's so fundamental. Again, the difference between money and currency, right? And this is the part that most of the economic doctrine that drives our central planning, and I totally agree with you. More and more, we're driving everything by central planning, right? Whether it's fiscal or monetary, it's now going to, they've essentially merged.
Energy.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And that's going to move into energy because energy, money, nature, gold, that has the link. Like energy has the link to real money. Currency is a very different system than that money. And currency is, again, created by policies that are off the actual monetary cycle, the energy and return on energy productive cycle that we used to have, right? When labor was tied to money, because if you've got a fixed wage, but that wage is tied to hard money, like your actual cycles work out. But right now, what that currency lever does, it redistributes, and it redistributes upwards, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Again, it's that waterfall. If I can get the money first, I can bid up existing assets, whether it's real estate, existing cash flow streams, and you bid up those assets. And that's where they have the lever, but they don't really have the lever to change the energy economy, right? And that's the part that really is breaking down. And that's why I'm saying they don't maybe have as much power as you think, because they actually can't change that. But again, this is where I think we're headed, is we are headed into this massive physical capex structure, which for the first couple of years is not going to work, right? So again, it's on one side saying we need to invest more, on the other at the local level, the political level, not allowing anyone to do any real work anymore, whether it's environmental standards, it's banking standards, it's political backlash to a new project, right? So we're going to try that for a few years. But I think what's going to ultimately happen as energy poverty, sort of spreads in the West, is we're going to say, okay, well, we have this lever of being able to underwrite debts of the corporate. So they're going to push the policy into the corporate, very much like, post-World War II, where we have these big oligopolies that are going to be forced to drive into these projects and spend capex. And it's essentially going to be underwritten by the government. I think that's where we're headed next, because it's the only way to sort of solve this problem of keeping the energy flowing in the West.
And that's basically the logic of Newton when he created the gold standard, because he had to deal with this new technological revolution called the currency, paper currency, banknotes starting to circulate. And people recognized that it was different than money, but the money was actually grounded in the natural order. And then over time, we lost sight of that. Humanity lost sight of that. And central banks started to take a different role. They became much closer to government. And then in the 1920s, you had John Maynard Keynes saying that the gold standard is a barbarous relic, and they followed that logic. But I think we've reached the point where it's central banking is the barbarous relic, because it's no longer any inkling of what Newton created back 320 years ago, which is still as relevant today because it's tied into the natural order.
So philosophically, I can follow where you're both going here, but practically, this isn't going to change overnight, right? We need good independent central banks. Governments aren't going to stop.
No, we need political will. Governments can change things overnight. The United States has done that twice. After the hyperinflation of the first currency of the country, they created the Constitution and put monetary provisions in it, gold and silver coin. They did it a second time in the 1860s after the war. They had a 10-year plan to resume to gold after creating the greenbacks, which were the artificial currency at the time. What you need is political will. It can happen. And you probably need 5, 10, 20 years to make it happen. But once you have the political will, it can be done.
Well, and this is a really important point because, to my mind, what politics is a mirror of society. So what we've been trying to do at Goldmoney is to help educate people, because we think this is an issue that transcends political ideologies. This really has to do with whether you agree that up isn't down, and the sky is blue, and grass is green. Do you believe in objective truth? You know, it's very fancy and trendy not to believe in objective truth these days. But if you help the person that's dealing with these issues understand this problem, then you're going to have elected officials that also understand them, because they're a reflection of the society. And James is right. It's basically a stroke of a pen to fix this, because in the US, for example, the central bank has 8,000 tons of gold. But not only that, the Constitution still defines the US dollar as a weight of gold and silver. It's this temporary suspension of the convertibility of the dollar into gold from 1971, which we still don't understand. Is it still temporary? I think that, there are, and we're not just speaking in a vacuum. We do speak to politicians, and we do interact with people in power. And this is a well-known solution that will be used if and when it needs to be deployed. And by the way, at the highest levels of central banking, they also know this.
Yeah. I think there are a lot of unintended consequences from central bank action, but at the end of the day, we could have been a lot worse off too.
Well, so it goes back to how you think about the economy. Like, do you think that what's more important in the economy is that the value of your house goes up? Or do you think the most important thing in the economy is that you have a way to self-actualize your skill and that you trust that as long as you work honestly, that the nobility of your toil is honored? In other words, a deflation happens and the price of your house collapses, but also your mortgage collapses. So basically you're in the same place. But the next day you still go to work and you work really hard. And at the end of the month, you get paid a wage. And for 30 or 40 years, you do that because, we're not supposed to work for more than 30 or 40 years. In Latin, there is this word otium, which means leisure. And neg otium means business. So business is defined as not leisure, because we're supposed to work so that we have leisure. And even the poorest people in history would generally work for a third of their life, or a little bit more than that. And so how do you achieve that? Well, you achieve that by producing more than you consume, and then preserving that surplus or your savings so that when you get older, you can use it. And that's what you gain from a deflation. And that's what the average person would be fine with. The question is, would you have this possibility where a billionaire could have 3 yachts with over 1,000 people that demand more resources than a city of 100,000 people? I don't know if that would be possible on a gold standard. I don't know if it would be possible to waste as much energy as the private jet industry wastes for the amount of people. I don't know if that, I think commercial jet flight would still be possible. I think EasyJet would work just fine on a gold standard. But I don't know if you would have all of these FBO and private jet operators. And so again, who is talking about this? The left. They might be using the language of carbon. They're right that when a wealthy person rides in a private jet, once they produce more carbon than a person in their whole year, right? But I don't really know too much about carbon. What I know is that they're wasting more energy than the average person. And I don't see why they have a right to more energy than the average person in this economy. I think that if they were measured in gold, they have a right to do whatever they want.
And with regard to the gold standard too, you're talking about savings. The average laborer would have more savings under the gold standard, more accumulated purchasing power to achieve that leisure as they got older.
Exactly.
I mean, I think one point is also that these cycles are very long, right?
Yes,
So, like,
yeah.
once you have a bailout, I mean, I think a lot of us, at least me, I was very surprised how far they could kick the can down the road. So your argument is basically, okay, what would have happened if they wouldn't jumped in and bailed all the banks out? And it's a question you can ask, but what is the result that they did it, right? And so we created now a bubble that is arguably a lot bigger than it was in 2008. So when this is deflating, and I think maybe we have to face the real world right now.
This is such a good point. You know what he's proving philosophically? The fact that they have now decided to change course proves they could have changed course back then too. That's the whole point.
Well, at what point,
I think
that's the tricky.
But
how do
they
you
changed
time it?
course. So the fact that they actually did it at a time where they blew up the bubble even more proves that they could have done it before. They're admitting that by doing it. They're saying we should have done it earlier, but we're doing it now.
Yeah, they have admitted that. I guess what I'm saying is,
By definition,
are we
they're
all
admitting that.
collectively, all levels of income of society, better off today than we would have been without the
But I
specific
think
action?
the question is
can you-
wrong.
can you
I
point-
think you have to ask the question, are we going to better off in 2 years or 3 years from now when this plays out?
No,
we're
I
still in
would
the
say today, I
deflation.
would like you to point me to either economic, cultural, any data point you want. Like, show me what we are better off in today versus
But we don't know what it
2008.
would have looked like.
No, but give me an example of something.
You mean we never really felt the depths of the crisis,
But-
right?
but
Because
so-
that was the nature of.
So are you saying
Separate.
housing prices are higher and they could have been lower?
I just think it could have been really ugly had we
But
not
so
had
how?
I don't know. It's counterfactual, right? We don't have the evidence.
Yeah,
so.
but we're looking within a framework. So I could see that housing prices might have still remained affordable for the wage earner for 15 years. I could see that perhaps you wouldn't have had tech companies trading at 6 times earnings.
Yeah.
And
But I think unemployment across all levels would have been much worse.
I'm
for a little bit, perhaps.
for a little
yeah.
bit, but I'm not sure whether this is actually true over the long run. We look at unemployment numbers are honestly, this is a complete mirage. It just means that employers cannot find people that can work. But if you look at something like the labor participation rate, it's extremely low.
It is.
Yes, it has recovered, but I mean, it's like a waterfall, right? It crashes and then they come in, bail everybody out, and then it slowly recovers. Then you have pandemic, it crashes, it's going to come back, but it never goes back to the level it ever was. And actually, if you dissect these numbers and just look at, for example, labor participation among young people. This looks
we're working.
terrible.
Well, Larry Summers has been
This
doing a
looks
great job
terrible.
talking about this because it's a mystery.
And they're like when you ask, or like when central bankers are pressed for this, they give like these answers like, well, people are retiring, there are more retired people, more people are in college. I mean, I looked into all of this. I don't think these are
Childcare
a
is
valid
expensive.
answer because actually the retired work more than they have ever worked because they have worked and they know, and they're in demand, and they have to work because they have no retirement savings anymore. And the people that go to college, I think there was a study out that 92% of them actually work. So the college people actually work more. It's really the people that are not in college and not retired, young people that don't work anymore. So they're not registered. That's it. But they're not working either. There's a huge
It's
part
important
of
to
the population that
recognize-
is out of the workforce.
Yeah, it's important to recognize what we were saying earlier about with markets, you have supply and demand, but you can get to a point where you just don't have supply.
Right.
And, what we want is to produce and to consume goods in an economy, right? And that is going to happen irrespective of what the interest rate is, what central banks do. The greater risk is always the political risk, the cultural risk, that if you push people to the point where they can't do that, when they can't go to the bazaar with their goods
Yeah.
and trade it for something else, then they're going to upend the political system. And that's why, again, this kind of solution is one that has to be adopted soon, because otherwise all of these other issues that I never remember growing up in the U.S. Like, I've never seen the kind of social issues that we're seeing, the class warfare, and the identity politics, and all these things that just really I cannot find another comparison to it. And I think that even this is a symptom of fake money and central bank policy.
I'd probably turn this a little bit different direction. I agree with the core of the banking system and good collateral to the currency, the good collateral to the credit, has to return to nature. It has to be, something like gold. But I think we've been talking a lot about, again, the top-down solutions. And look, we're all in the business of thinking about how how the top-down works. I'm again working on a macroeconomic, commodity exchange for this. But I think it's also very important to look at the bottom up, right? And looking at where the power sits, dispersed broadly in the population when you go through these currency crises. I referenced earlier the real energy crisis right now are places like India and Pakistan. So what is their government doing to defend their currency? They're selling U.S. treasuries. They're selling their collateral there. But what is the actual population? What do they have? They have gold jewelry. Their resilience, their ability to feed themselves and provide energy has been protected by the value of their jewelry. Right? And that's still what most of the global population understands. So that's how wealth still stays. But it's not just the metal. It's also energy. So it's the people that are closer to nature. It's the farmers, and like everyone knows, during these resets, it's also the farmland that's valuable. So it's farming, it's energy, it's metals. And that is the fundamental money of the economy because it's connected to nature. And I know Roy's written a whole book about this, which again, it sounds so simple, but it's been lost in the political dynamic. So, from a top down, what perhaps happens, I've written or theorized about some of this as well. And and by the way, in 2020, when oil went negative, like I put out a tweet that said, oil will be over $100 within 2 years. Nobody on earth was believing oil was going to over 100, 2 years. Yeah. But again, if you had a framework to look at it, we saw this coming. So I would say the next piece of that is there will be a point where the only way to rebase the currency is going to be tying it back to labor, and labor is going to demand some sort of hard asset for their wage. Yeah. So that's the piece. And at that point, I do believe those that still have gold in their banking system, they're going to have to make a market. Like, almost overnight, something like the Federal Reserve is going to have to say, we're going to do just like, Brazil or an emerging market overnight devalues themselves to the US dollar. The US dollar itself is going to have to devalue itself to energy and gold. Exactly. They're going to say, we're going to make a market in gold between this price. We're going to make a market in the strategic petroleum reserves at this price. They're going to have to make a market to rebalance energy and gold and farmland and everything else against the currency they overcreated.
I quite agree with that. And when we took over Hong Kong from the Japanese military at the end of the Second World War, the military yen was completely valueless. But the way in which we distributed money through the economy was to give an exchange rate between the new Hong Kong dollar, and I think it was something like 5,000 of the military yen. We recognized that the yen was absolutely valueless, but we needed the old currency as a means of distributing the new. So that is the way in which it's done, quite clearly. And but the problem we have, I think, if we just concentrate on the dollar for the moment, is that the American government has been in such denial about the role of gold that it is going to be reluctant to do it until well down the process. And the other reason they will be reluctant is they know what the Chinese have got, they know what Russia has got, and they're still in a power struggle against Asia, trying to retain their empire, as it were. Right. So all these factors militate to a complete re-education and a complete acceptance that their role in the world is not what it used to be. And that tells me that the exchange rate that will eventually settle down between gold and the dollar will be the dollar will be worth considerably less in terms of gold than it is today.
So this is where we would argue something different, is that there is one ultimate scarcity that drives everything, and that's the scarcity of time, right? So,
Yep.
so again,
and
in very short time periods, that scarcity of time can be wildly volatile, and it doesn't matter, right? But you stretch that arrow of time, and again, you come back to nothing but the laws of nature and physics, right? And so when we're looking for money, like to close some of these circles, gold represents perfect money because it has the scarcity that has a very high energy cost to produce. Because it's so rare, it takes the most energy to get out of the ground, right? So it's got a very high cost in energy, but then it lasts forever unchanged, right? So you can, again, over cycles, there'll be, lots of volatility in time, but you stretch it, it lasts. And again, going back to the point of copper, it's not completely subjective, right? Or even rice or grains.
Listen, you can subjectively
all
indulge yourself that you can grow wheat at Hyde Park, but if you don't sow the seeds at a specific time in the year, and if you don't toil with the land in a specific way, and if you don't harvest at a specific time, and then all you get is the same thing that anyone else would get. You get a standard of measure and reward that comes from nature. So you can subjectively idealize how much wheat you might produce, but nature sets how much wheat you might produce. And this is true of all the basic elements and commodities that we need. And so rather than price, what we're looking at are intrinsic relationships that are natural. And it's fine to superimpose price on it. It's obvious that those relationships oscillate in a market, and those relationships even express that interval that we go through from subsistence to post-subsistence. But the whole point of a recession, the whole point of an economic slowdown, is to remind us that we need to move back to the point where we can not reach subsistence.
Well,
because that interval of post-subsistence is dependent on us not going back to subsistence.
Well, let's talk.
Okay.
Sorry, go on.
Well, I'm hesitant to break this up, but we do have a scarcity of time
Yes.
on our hands. So, Alasdair, why don't you continue by concluding with these remarks as well, and everyone will have some concluding remarks.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is that all this talk about a reset and so on, everybody assumes that the governments will take the lead in a reset. I think that's a big mistake. It's not going to happen. The reset will be set by people, it will be set by markets. Markets, at the end of the day, always set the prices. They always set the relationships between goods and services, if I can use that phrase, with money, whether it's money or credit being in the middle. And what we're going to see, I think, developing, and it's already started, is a contraction of credit. And the contraction of credit is mainly with the banks. The banks have got themselves over-leveraged. The reason they got themselves over-leveraged was because with very low interest rates, their margins shrank, and the only way they could retain profitability was to increase the size of their balance sheets. They're now in a situation where you've got rising interest rates, the qualities of their loans are deteriorating very rapidly. They're now getting frightened about losses. So what do? They withdraw currency by contracting their balance sheets. And contracting their balance sheets, guess what GDP is? It is basically every transaction which is financed through bank credit. So what will happen is that GDP starts contracting. It's not so much as everybody thinks, the economy is going into recession, whatever. No, it's just that the credit is being taken out of the economy. That is actually what happens. And so what we will see is a response from the central banks to try and replace that credit. We're going back to the John Law situation. What people will see is the purchasing power of central bank currency is a lot more obviously risky than bank credit, which they don't really understand. And I think when you see a massive expansion in the quantity of central bank currency, that will begin to really undermine the purchasing power of the currencies.
Fair enough. Josh?
I think my ending point is we've got to fight for markets. I don't believe that's a given. I believe that the period we're heading in is going to be, the manipulation is going to get into a hyperscale, and we've got to have to fight for bottom-up markets. I think at the individual level, at the money versus currency level, I think people need to realize that owning something like this on your wrist is going to be better than pretty much any other asset you can own. through this cycle. It's going to preserve your ability to buy energy, to buy food in a very stable way versus anything else. So I think at the individual level, and the more we can get that distributed, the more democracy. Markets work best when you have the broader market, broader liquidity, broader information. And then from the top down, I think we have to fight for markets, particularly commodity markets. And again, this is what I've been focused on building, is bringing the clearinghouse where real physical title and goods trade clear at that ultimate level needs to be physical. It can't be manipulated. It can't be manipulated by indexes. It can't be manipulated by sovereign debt as being the primary collateral, because it's not. And so I think we just need to fight for markets.
Stefan?
I think my final conclusions is here that we are in a very precarious situation, actually, I think, in global energy markets, where we had, you can say, a decade or so at least of underinvestments, and that we're going to see that's going to bite us at some point. I think, and I don't want to, I'm opening a completely new topic here, but I think, and what we haven't talked about is, I think also we're going into a recession right now, and it's probably going to be a pretty bad recession given the kind of bubbles we're coming out of. And that might actually give a kind of a mirage that things are getting better. So that could be a period where actually inflation is slowing down, and they're looking at this and say, see, what we're doing is working. But it's just because for a short period of time, we're actually destroying a lot of demand that happens in economic contraction. So just give you an example, like when oil was 150 in 2008, it went to $30 on roughly a 3% demand contraction for oil. So now we have like this really stretched out energy markets in many places. And if you actually do get a stronger recession, you will see this stuff come off, and like a lot of things they look like, oh, we're solving this, but it's not really true. And the problem, if you're doing this, you're giving even less incentive to invest in these markets. Right. So we're already seeing there's nobody's financing anything, and that basically will then be the final nail in the coffin for these markets. And we're just pushing it further out, and the longer we wait, the worse it gets. So in a way, this is comparable to the whole situation in financial markets and in like what central banks are doing, you're just pushing it out, but eventually there will be a day where you have to pay. I think in commodity markets it becomes much quicker because there is a physical reality behind which you cannot cheat. Yeah. And the problem with financial market is that you can cheat for a very long time, and this system has been proven to be extremely resilient. I say it out loud, I would never have thought that they are able to raise interest rates to the levels they are right now. I would have thought everything would have crashed at this point in time. And so, but things are still going, and I think there will be, at some point, there will be a moment, and then things move very, very quickly. And so now we are in this situation where this whole financial house of cards is collapsing in a way, and at the same time we are in a very bad spot, and it's actually not just energy, it's across commodities. I mean, you look at things like copper inventories are at all-time low, all this kind of stuff. So this now all comes together. I think the source of the problem is actually the same. But yeah, I mean, and that goes back to your initial question, kind of, I think we just made things worse with this. And when it's going to come to bite us, it's going to be pretty bad.
All right. James?
Yeah, I'd like to illustrate my final comments with two charts. The first one looks at crude oil, which I use as a proxy for energy, because energy is important to our society, to our standard of living. And you can see on this chart, I measure the energy with four different things, 3 national currencies and gold. And the interesting thing is that you can see the rise in national currencies, which reflects the diminishment of purchasing power of those currencies. Now, it's not identical because some currencies are managed more poorly than the others. And recently, the British pound, which is the worst of the currencies, a cost of crude oil, a barrel of crude oil, was 100 times more than it was back in January 1950. But the line at the bottom of the chart is the cost of crude oil in terms of ounces or grams of gold. There's been basically no change whatsoever. So that is it's been something that's, I think really, I can't explain it other than to say that it's maybe by chance, or maybe it's a conscious design of intelligent creators, intelligent design, something like that. But it works. It's worked that way for thousands of years. That's why gold's been money for 5,000 years. It's called the golden constant. Gold is always the measuring stick in which we in society interact with one another. Now, the second chart goes back to central banks. The central banks claim that they're there to maintain a stable price. Well, the first chart shows that that's not true. The second chart, which is done on a log scale, makes it very, very clear. The reason why central banks cannot maintain a stable price is that there are four forces at work. There's a supply and demand of money, and then there's a supply and demand of the commodity that's being measured. And you cannot predict how those four forces are going to interact with one another. And you can see on this chart that there are fluctuations in crude oil, but those fluctuations occur from these four natural forces, and gold still ends up purchasing over long periods of time the same amount of energy as it had in previous eras. So my point is that we have to go back to gold. Preferably, I'd like to go back in a private environment rather than governments, because governments and central banks have proven that they cannot responsibly, professionally, like adults, manage gold, or manage currencies. So we have to go back to gold one way or the other. And the sooner we do it, the better. It may be a lot of pain, it may be, maybe not. Maybe there are ways to do it. We've done it before in the past. All we need is the political will and the mechanism set out and a plan to do it. It just takes a little bit of time and a little bit of thinking.
Thank you, James.
Agree.
Roy?
Yeah, I think that when Josh said fighting for markets, it just reminded me that I actually think that there's this big error in worshiping the invisible hand. And we have to recognize that the invisible hand is just metabolization. That's what's actually taking place. And this is what this crisis is reminded us about. And so we need to remind people, and that's what we're hoping to do with this video, that they need to demand that their money be as good as food and as good as energy. And in a post-subsistence society, that's what gold does. It's money that is as good as food and as good as energy. And so, yeah, thank you all very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists. I know some of you who have flown extremely far, all the way from Denver in Josh's case. And it's been in Washington, D.C. in my case. But it has been a real honor and pleasure speaking with all of you. I know I certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure our viewers did too. So thank you for watching. We hope to see you again next year, same place, same time perhaps. But thank you very much to everyone. And that is your Gold Money Roundtable for 2022.